Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around the big bad himself, Yawgmoth, Thran Physician. As always, I've built this deck to cost less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including the cost of basic lands at 10 cents each, and the link to the deck list will be in the description down below. Now let's take a look at this deck. So, our commander is Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, a 2/4 legendary human cleric for 2 generic and 2 black mana that has protection from humans. Additionally, Yawgmoth has 2 abilities. One, where you pay 1 life and sack a creature, and then you put a -1/-1 counter on a target creature, then draw a card. And the second ability has you pay 2 black mana to discard a card, and then you proliferate. So Yawgmoth gets access to creature removal and the ability to pump up counters right out of the box. Powerful abilities that can be steered in a number of directions to make an effective deck, which brings us to the goals of this specific deck. To begin, Yawgmoth is going to want a buttload of black mana for his discard ability, which changes how we're going to focus on our ramp. We'll still use some staples, but we're also going to make use of ramp spells that give mana based off of counters, as we can proliferate those counters to get massive amounts of mana later on. A significant portion of this deck is also going to be focused on providing sacrifice fuel, either through creature token generation, or creatures that we can regenerate or cast from our graveyard, which will allow us to fuel Yawgmoth as our primary source of both draw and creature removal. As we'll be proliferating a lot to remove opponent creatures, we can simultaneously pump up a handful of evasive creatures that can easily attain +1/+1 counters for themselves, as once that creature gets a counter, we can buff it a ton for every proliferation we do. This, combined with a wide board of creature tokens, should allow us to smack hard while keeping our opponent's creatures in check. Additionally, Yawgmoth has a large number of actions in the text, which we can look to synergize with to get some added value while just doing Yawgmoth things. This includes aristocrats cards, but this can also apply to things like discarding, paying life, and the like. Also, as a quick note, infect is really powerful with Yawgmoth, mostly due to that proliferate ability, but I personally didn't want to use it as a win con for this deck, so it won't be making an appearance in this video. However, it should be fairly straightforward to adapt this deck into a poison deck if you so choose. That being said, let's move on to the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. Starting with some staples, Mind Stone gives us generic mana, Wayfarer's Bauble lets us tutor a basic swamp onto the battlefield tapped, and then Charcoal Diamond and Arcane Signet gives us black mana, and Fellwar Stone is likely to give us black mana. Then we have Gauntlet of Power, which has you choose a color, so for us black, and then creatures of that color gain +1/+1, and a basic land tap for the mana of that color produces an additional mana of that color. So this effectively doubles the number of swamps we have, while also buffing most of our creatures. Crowded Crypt is a mana rock tapping for black, but whenever a creature we control dies, we put a corpse counter on it, something that we can proliferate. Then for 4 generic and a black, we can tap and sacrifice Crowded Crypt to make a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed for each corpse counter on it. So this can act as ramp early on, and then it can be a huge source of sacrifice fuel in our later game. Black Market is an enchantment that gets a charge counter whenever a creature dies, not just our own. And then at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you gain a black mana for each charge counter on Black Market. Empowered Auto Generator enters the battlefield tapped, but then it taps to put a charge counter on it, and then makes X mana of any one color of our choosing, with X being the number of charge counters on it. Replicating Ring is a fun one in this deck, as it taps for any color and, on your upkeep, it gains a night counter. And then if it has 8 or more night counters on it, you remove all the counters from Replicating Ring, and make 8 tokens called Replicated Ring, with tap, add 1 mana of any color, and then the process starts all over again on the next upkeep. Since we'll be proliferating a bunch, we can reach 8 counters fairly quickly and gain a buttload of mana from it. Then there's Astral Cornucopia, which gets a charge counter for each 3 mana spent on it while casting, and then it taps for a mana of any one color of your choosing for each charge counter on it. And finally, we have Everflowing Chalice, which gets a charge counter for every 2 mana spent on it while casting, and it makes a generic mana for each charge counter on it. While generic mana may not help us to proliferate with Yawgmoth, we still have plenty of generic mana costs throughout this deck that we can use this mana on. But now that we have a bunch of mana to work with, let's start looking at this deck's other field type, low-cost creatures to sacrifice. First up, Tenacious Dead can be returned to the battlefield if you pay a generic and a black when it dies, so provided you have the mana, you can keep bringing this back to sacrifice again. Cult Conscript can be returned to the battlefield from the graveyard for 1 generic and a black mana, provided a non-skeleton creature you control died that turn. It's a little limiting, but the vast majority of our sack fuel will be non-skeleton. Actually, it'll be mostly zombies. Persistent Specimen and Reassembling Skeleton can be returned to the battlefield from the graveyard for 2 generic and a black, and 1 generic and a black, respectively. Then Haunt of the Dead Marshes can be returned to the battlefield for 2 generic and a black, provided you control a legendary creature, and additionally it lets you scry 1 whenever it enters the battlefield. And then there's Butcher Ghoul with Undying, so when it dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, it returns to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. Now, moving on to creature token generation, for one-off casts, we have Dark Salvation, Dread Summons, and From Under the Floorboards. Dark Salvation makes X 2/2 zombie creature tokens based off of how much mana was spent casting it, and then you give a target creature -1/-1 for each zombie you control. Dread Summons has everyone mill X, depending on the mana spent casting it, and you make a 2/2 zombie for each creature that was put into the graveyard this way. From Under the Floorboards gives you 3 2/2 zombies, and you gain 3 life for 5 total mana. But with Yawgmoth's discard, we can easily access its madness cost of X and 2 black, which lets you make X 2/2 zombies and gain X life. Empty the Pits is another X mana spell creating X 2/2 zombie creature tokens, but it also has Delve, which lets us exile cards from our graveyard to help pay generic mana costs. And given that we'll be looking to discard a bunch of stuff to proliferate, we can potentially get a large number for X without tapping out all of our mana for the turn. Army of the Damned makes 13 2/2 black zombie creature tokens for 5 generic and 3 black, and then it can be recast for its flashback costs for 2 extra generic mana from the graveyard to get another 13 zombies, which would give us plenty of board presence and sacrifice fuel, even though it's a little mana expensive. And then finally, for one-off token generation, we have Shrine of Loyal Legions, which gets a charge counter on each of your upkeeps, and technically whenever you cast a white spell, but with mono black we ain't gonna do that. But those counters can be proliferated, and then when sack fuel is needed, the Shrine of Loyal Legions can be sacrificed for 3 mana, and you make a 1/1 colorless mirror token for each charge counter on Shrine of Loyal Legions. Then we have Piper of the Swarm and Orochi Hatchery, which can be tapped to make creature tokens. Piper of the Swarm makes a 1/1 black rat for a generic and a black mana, and it gives a Rat's Menace. And Orochi Hatchery makes X 1/1 green snakes for each charge counter on it, and that number is determined by the mana spent casting it, but we can proliferate those counters to make more tokens. Then we have Jadar, Cool Color of Nephalia, which makes a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed if you control no creatures with Decayed, and it'll help ensure that we have at least 1 creature that's good to sacrifice each turn. And Trexar, Master Breeder, makes X 1/1 Thrall creature tokens whenever you cast a creature spell, with X being that creature spell's mana cost. However, if you control 7 or more Thralls, you sacrifice Edrixar, so ideally you'd sacrifice enough Thralls to always keep Edrixar on the field. Then Ghoul Collar Giza lets you sacrifice another creature to make X 2/2 zombies, where X is the sacrifice creature's power. And then, to get some added value from Yawgmoth things, we have Dying to Serve and Nest of Scarabs. Dying to Serve has you make a 2/2 zombie whenever you discard 1 or more cards, though this only happens once per turn. But Nest of Scarabs can be broken in this deck, as it makes a 1/1 black insect creature token whenever you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature. Get 1 insect on the field, and then you have a replenishing source of sacrifice fodder, as sacrificing that insect with Yawgmoth will make another insect. Sacrificing something else will make an insect, and proliferating those -1/-1 counters will make many insects. But now that we have a bunch of fuel to let us draw and deal with our opponent's creatures, let's look at some evasive creatures that we can easily pump while we proliferate. First up is our only non-flyer in this chapter, which is Stonecoil Serpent, a snake that costs X to cast, gets X +1/+1 counters, and has reach, trample, and protection from multicolor. Then we have Drana, Liberator of Malakir, and Miri the Cursed, both with flying and first strike, and Miri also has haste. When Drana deals combat damage to a player, you get a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control, which includes Drana, and that can be proliferated up. And then Miri gets a +1/+1 counter whenever it deals combat damage to a player. Necrosquito has flying and enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters, and then it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. Gurgling Anointer also has flying and gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you draw your second card each turn. Additionally, when it dies, you can return a creature with a mana value less than or equal to Gurgling Anointer's power from the graveyard onto the battlefield. Then Tabarax, Hope's Demise, is a flyer that gains +1/+1 counters whenever a non-token creature you control dies, and it gains lifelink if it has 5 or more +1/+1 counters on it. Then Ravenous Harpy gets a +1/+1 counter if you sacrifice a creature to it. Scavenger Drake gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another creature dies, not just our own. And Sengir, the Dark Baron, gets 2 +1/+1 counters whenever a creature dies. And if a player loses the game, you gain life equal to their life total at the start of that turn. And now that we have some cards that can be proliferated to swing for big damage, let's go over some cards that will give us some extra value whenever we do Yawgmoth things. First, there's Scheming Aspirant, which has each opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life whenever you proliferate. Whenever you pay life, Font of Agonies gains blood counters equal to the amount of life paid, and then for 1 generic and a black mana, 4 blood counters can be removed to destroy a target creature. Just a bit of extra interaction. Psychosis Crawler has each opponent lose a life whenever we draw a card, and has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in your hand. And then we have Ruthless Sniper, Faith of the Devoted, and Feast of Sanity, which activate whenever we discard a card. Ruthless Sniper puts a -1/-1 counter on a target creature if we pay 1 generic when discarding. Faith of the Devoted has each opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life if you pay 1 generic when discarding. And then Feast of Sanity deals 1 damage to any target and you gain 1 life whenever you discard, but that one doesn't require payment. Then Death Greeter lets you gain 1 life whenever another creature dies. Mirkwood Bats has each opponent lose a life whenever you create or sacrifice a token. And Zulaport Cutthroat has each opponent lose a life and you gain a life whenever a creature you control dies. Agent of the Iron Throne gives our commander creature, whenever an artifact or creature you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses a life. Relic Vial can be used to sacrifice a creature and draw, but since Yawgmoth is a cleric, provided he's on the board, we get, whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. And finally, Vindictive Vampire deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain a life whenever a creature you control dies. Now I'd quickly like to go over a few cards that didn't directly fit into any of these chapters, but have good synergy in the deck. First up we have Midnight Banshee and Corrosive Mentor, both with Wither, an ability that has a creature deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. Midnight Banshee also has, at the beginning of your upkeep, put a -1/-1 counter on each non-black creature, which of course you can then proliferate with Yawgmoth. And then Corrosive Mentor gives all black creatures we control Wither. Hangerback Walker and Titan Forge can be additional sources of creature tokens. Hangerback Walker is an X mana spell that enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter for every 2 mana spent casting it. And, when it dies, you make a 1/1 colorless Thopter creature token with flying for each +1/+1 counter on it. And it can be tapped to put another counter on Hangerback Walker. Titan Forge can be tapped with 3 mana to get a charge counter, and then it can be tapped to remove 3 charge counters from it to make a 9/9 colorless golem token. However, with proliferating, once 1 counter is on this card, you should be able to get 9/9s fairly frequently, though admittedly these tokens probably aren't the best to sacrifice aside from with like Ghoul Color Giza. And finally we have Grey Merchant of Asphodel, or Gary, and Exsanguinate, both great for draining our opponents and refilling our life after paying a bunch to sacrifice creatures. Gary has opponents lose life equal to your devotion to black, and you gain the amount of life lost this way. And Exsanguinate is a spell for X and 2 black mana, having our opponents lose X life and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. But given that Yawgmoth is central to our plan, we should go through some cards that we can use to try to keep them on the board a little bit longer. First up we have Kaya's Ghost Form and Minions Return, or enchantments that have the enchanted creature return to the battlefield under your control when it dies. Kaya's Ghost Form also working when exiled. Also, something to note, Minions Return can also enchant any creature, not just ones you control, and it can be cast at instant speed due to flash, so it could just be used to steal an opponent's creature if they happen to have something spicy that you want. Then, Ring of Zathrid is an equipment that can be used to regenerate its equipped creature. It also gives its equipped creature a +1/+1 counter on your upkeep provided that creature is black, which would apply for Yawgmoth and the vast majority of our creatures. Then we have Mask of Avacyn, Swiftfoot Boots, and Mirror Shield, all equipment that give hexproof. Mask of Avacyn also gives +1/+2, Swiftfoot Boots also gives haste, and Mirror Shield also gives +2 toughness, and whenever a creature with Death Touch blocks or is blocked by this creature, destroy that creature. But now that we've gone through all of our spells, let's quickly go over our lands. Due to budgeting reasons and the desire for black mana, we only have 1 non-basic land in this deck, which is Myriad Landscape, a small mana ramp on a land. And aside from that, we'll fill our deck with 34 basic swamps. Now let's take a look at that price. And as you can see, this deck is currently just under $45 at the time of recording, which includes the cost of basic lands at 10 cents each, but wouldn't include things like taxes and shipping. Now let's quickly go over some upgrades you may wish to consider for this deck. First up is Karn's Bastion, which can be used to proliferate without having to discard. Then Blood Artist is a great aristocrats piece, and Bone Miser can give us a huge amount of value while discarding with Yawgmoth. Then a Yara, First of Lochthwain, will drain our opponents while we're making a bunch of our zombie creature tokens or casting our skeletons from the grave. Geralf's Messenger is probably one of the best creatures with Undying, if you're wanting to lean into that combo. Blowfly Infestation can help us keep more -1/-1 counters on the board, transferring one to a new creature whenever we kill off a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it. And Crumbling Ashes lets us destroy a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it without having to drain it to 0 toughness. With Proliferate, Darksteel Reactor can be a big alternative win con in a Yawgmoth deck, and Lux Cannon can be used to interact with non-creature permanents. You may also wish to add a bit more protection for Yawgmoth, so we can add equipment that grants indestructible, things such as Mithril Coat, Darksteel Plate, and Champion's Helm. And finally, if you feel Yawgmoth isn't providing enough interaction, you may wish to include some board wipes such as Black Sun Zenith and Plague Wind, the former putting X -1/-1 counters on each creature, which works extremely well if you happen to have Nest of Scarabs on the field, and the latter destroys all creatures we don't control. But that all being said, if you would like to build, adapt, upgrade, or play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and if you'd like more budget commander decks, consider dropping a sub. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.